So I'm here today to talk to you about American classical education. And I'm coming from Hillsdale College, as Mr. Anthony said. We here at Hillsdale have had an interest in the education of young people, younger than 18 to 22, which is the normal age for students that a college is interested in, for a very long time. And we think that it's part of our mission to improve the education that is provided in American public and private schools. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that work today and then explain to you about classical education. Mr. Anthony, can you just confirm that the presentation is coming up well? I just want to make sure everyone can see it.
It is indeed. It looks
Excellent.
good.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, good. Good. Well, as I mentioned, we're talking about American classical education today. Hillsdale College has been involved in K-12 education for a long time, since 1990. We at the college are not only interested in the education of our 18 through 22-year-olds, but we think that part of our work is teaching the country. And so if you look at the work of Hillsdale College, you'll see that we do a lot of outreach. We have a bunch of online courses which have millions of people enrolled in them. We do a lot of conferences and fellowships for people of all ages. And since 1990, we've been working with young students to help them receive a classical education. Hillsdale Academy is a private school that was founded 30 years ago this year. And it's here on the campus of Hillsdale College, and there are several hundred students who attend it, K through 12. My work started in K through 12 education started as part of the Barney Charter School Initiative. The Barney Charter School Initiative is an outreach effort of the college that supports public charter schools across the country. We advise those schools in 5 areas: curriculum, culture, pedagogy, or great teaching, in other words, leadership, and governance. And through the support of friends of the college, we are seeing a renaissance in American public schools, a return to American classical education, which is something that our country, if you look back a couple of generations, did very, very well, and is something that still works and that we would like to see more of in our country. Let me talk to you a little bit about our mission so you can understand the nature of our work, and then I'll talk to you about the schools that we're working with, and then I'll explain whether it's working and why it's working. This is our mission at the Barney Charter School Initiative. Our job is to promote the founding of classical charter schools and excellence in their teaching and operations so that public school students may be educated in the liberal arts and sciences and receive instruction in the principles of moral character and civic virtue. In other words, we assist local groups of citizens in founding classical charter schools in their areas. And over the years, we've worked with many dozens of groups all across the country, and they have yielded 24 classical charter schools in which 12,000 students are enrolled. Our work is merely to advise these schools on the 5 areas I mentioned. And what we like to see in a successful school is a liberal arts education, a well-rounded education, and an education that not only fills students' minds with information, but teaches them about moral character and civic virtue as well. We're interested not just in what our students know, but what kind of people they become as a result of their education. This is some information about the schools that we have worked with. There are 24, as I mentioned. They are all over the place. They're in 11 states. And looking at the interest that we've received in recent months, I think that in the next couple of years we'll be in up to 15 or 16 states. We have 3 brand new schools that are opening this fall. They're in Tallahassee, Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, and Windsor, Colorado. And we receive applications from schools all the time, and we expect 4 new schools to start a year from now or in coming years. So you can see that the schools are all over the place. All of these schools are public charter schools, which means they're absolutely free to attend. And there are no admissions requirements to attend a charter school. They accept any student that would like to come. If there are more students who would like to come than available seats, then they do a random lottery, and the students who come are just randomly chosen. That's one major difference between public charter schools and private schools. Private schools, of course, have tuition requirements and admissions requirements as well. I think it's a beautiful thing that these students are attending public charter schools because they're just average American kids. Across the country, they come from every type of neighborhood you can think of, every type of background you can think of, and they're all receiving an education based on the same principles, the principles outlined in our mission. Over the course of the last year before the coronavirus, I visited almost all of these schools in person. In March, when the coronavirus hit and travel was suspended, we still had a Texas trip to make, and we had an Idaho trip to make. So those are the schools that I haven't seen this last year. But all of the rest of them I've seen, and they are very different from each other, and they're also beautiful in their work. Let me move on to the next slide here. Excuse me for just a minute. I've lost the ability to, there we go. Oh, so let me mention one more thing about our schools. Thank you. I want to mention the success that they're seeing. So as I said, all of these schools are classical schools. They're identical in their principles, and they're very, very similar in their curriculum and their teaching style. And I'll describe in a minute for you what classical education is so that you can imagine what's going on in the classrooms of these schools. But let me just tell you now that the academic results of these schools are very impressive. All of these states, because they're public schools, require their schools to because they're publicly funded, require their schools to take a test, a state test of some sort, to gauge students' progress. And looking at the results of those tests, we can evaluate how Hillsdale-affiliated schools are doing compared to the local public schools, where students are zoned to attend. And I'm proud to tell you that 71% of the students enrolled in Hillsdale schools either get the highest possible score on the state test, or they beat the scores of the local public schools. And so even by the measure that traditional public schools use, these schools are doing very well. Another way of measuring success is looking at college entrance exams. The SAT, the ACT, and this new college admissions test called the Classic Learning Test, or CLT. Students in Hillsdale-affiliated schools score 150 points above the national average on the SAT. They score 5 points above the national average on the ACT. And if you look at the top 25 schools in the country on the Classic Learning Test, 3 of those schools are Hillsdale-affiliated schools, including our own Hillsdale Academy right here in Michigan. That's one way of measuring the success of these schools. My favorite way of measuring the success is just to walk around the schools and see what the students are like and see how the teachers are interacting with them and see the culture of the place. And by that measure, the measure of common sense, I like to call it, the schools are doing beautiful work. The students are happy, they are productive. You can tell that they think at every level, kindergarten through 12th grade, that the work that they're doing in school is important. They're not doing it strictly because they have to. They're doing it because it seems important to them and because they're interested. I like also to think about the work of the teachers in these schools. These schools attract really quite educated people, people with master's degrees and in some cases doctoral degrees. They look for people who are masters of their subjects, and they give them the freedom to teach what they know in a way that is effective, in a way that gives them a lot of responsibility in addition to freedom. So the teachers are happy too, and these schools are becoming places where the very best teachers want to be teaching because of that freedom that they get. So we're proud of this work. We think it's working, and I'd like to talk to you about what exactly happens in these schools. Why is it working? And the best way to do that is to talk about classical education. What is classical education? Classical education is not a new idea. It's not an idea that we at Hillsdale College invented. It's the way that education used to be done in this country, and its roots are in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world, in ancient Greece and Rome. Today, if you visit a Hillsdale Classical School, you will see that students are, first of all, learning fundamental skills in the early grades. This student on the background of this slide, you can see that she's writing by hand, and even something as simple as that is rare in public schools today. There's been a massive transition to technology, and it's very common to see even very young students using iPads and screens and computers rather than books and paper. These fundamental skills are important. No matter who you are, no matter what you're going to do with yourself, and no matter what you want to learn, it's very important that you are able to read things and understand them. It's very important that you're able to write things, both do the physical act of writing by hand and also the intellectual act of writing something that makes sense. It's very important that you're able to do arithmetic, including mental mathematical calculations. And it's very important that you're able to memorize things. If you go to one of our schools, you will see a lot of things that used to happen when my grandparents were in school, for example. Kids are writing in cursive. They're diagramming sentences. They are memorizing and reciting speeches and texts from American history. They're memorizing poetry. And it's a back to basics approach. It's a return to those fundamental skills that we seem to have forgotten about in many public schools today. Classical education is also a content-rich education. We take a well-rounded approach in thinking about what K through 12 students need to learn. Whether you're 5 years old or 12 years old or 18 years old, you have not fully turned into who you're going to be. And no matter what you're going to be, you need to have a well-rounded education. And so these schools are liberal arts schools. They're like Hillsdale College, which is a liberal arts college. There's a common curriculum that all students study, and it's balanced across the four core disciplines. Students study literature, they study history, they study mathematics, they study science, they study Latin, and they study art and music, no matter who they are. And because they have this well-rounded, content-rich approach, they're receiving an education that is a solid foundation for further academic work or further skills-based work. It's an education that prepares them for whatever the world might present to them after they finish their high school years. Classical schools also are thoughtful about the order in which students learn things. I'll give an example of this. In the early years of your education in a classical school, your education is, you're in what we call in classical ed, the grammar phase. And grammar means not just parts of speech and sentence diagramming, but learning the basic building blocks of a subject. Anytime you're learning something new, you have to first learn what are the parts that make up that subject. If you're studying biology, for example, human biology, you have to learn what are the parts of the human body and what are their names. And that's always going to be the first step. Even for the most sophisticated, talented doctor, that's always the first step. We call that the grammar of the subject of human biology, the building blocks of it. After you've learned the grammar of a subject, then you're ready to go to what we call the logic phase, which is the phase where you think about how the parts of that subject, how the building blocks of that subject fit together. So to go with our human body analogy, we can say that after you've learned the parts of the human body, the organs of the human body, that's when you start studying things like the endocrine system or the digestive system. You learn how they fit together, and that gives you a deeper understanding of the human body. You couldn't get to that that level of understanding if you hadn't first done the grammar stage, though. So in classical education, we begin by memorizing the parts, and then we figure out how they go together. And once we have the grammar stage and the logic stage down, then we're ready to start thinking about the rhetoric stage, which is another word for thinking about things and why they are important. Whether this particular human body is working well or poorly, well, you have to have the foundational understanding in order to make a judgment about whether something is good or bad. And that is a higher purpose. The rhetoric stage allows you to ask important questions, more important questions than the simple, what and how of something. But you can't ask those deeper questions until you've gotten the what and the how down. So a classical school, all of the schools that we work with are K through 12 schools, or they have plans to become K through 12 schools. The reason for that is that it allows us to make sure that students receive the foundational elements of their education first. They begin by studying the what, and then they talk about the how, and then they talk about the why and whether it's good or bad. And it's a beautiful thing to watch a student go through the K through 12 years in these schools. Before I worked at Hillsdale College, I founded one of these schools in Austin, Texas. And our first kindergarten class is now entering 5th grade. And you can tell when you talk to those students, they're different than the students who started higher up in the grades because they have that foundation and they've received their entire education in an order that makes sense. So these schools are content rich, they're well-rounded, they focus on basic foundational skills, but also they fulfill a higher purpose. In their curriculum and in their teaching and in their culture, they recognize that human beings are made to be educated and that human beings have a certain nature, and the education that we receive ought to be fitted to that nature. When I was in graduate school, I wrote my dissertation on Aristotle, and I wrote it specifically on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is this book that is the first, I think, and the first most important book written on human nature and what it means to be a happy and good and thriving human being. And looking back on Aristotle, I find what he said about education and human nature true, even though he was writing many thousands of years ago. Aristotle says that all human beings, by our nature, desire to know. And he has a distinction between living creatures. Animals are also living creatures, plants are also living creatures, but human beings are the only living creatures who have reason, have the ability to think and understand. And in particular, there are two types of things Aristotle explains that we want to know. There are two types of things we want to know. One is we want to know about ourselves. We want to know what it is to be a human being. And we're curious about our own souls, our own nature, what will make us happy, what things we can do to live a good life. And we're also curious about other human beings, how our governments ought to be structured, for example, how we ought to get along with each other. We're curious about friendship. And so our desire to know is rooted in part in our desire to know about ourselves and about other human beings. Aristotle says we're also interested in knowing about the world. We're not just curious about human beings, we're curious about the non-human world. So we find it interesting to study plants and animals, and we study geography. We're interested in space. And if any of you have studied astronomy, you know that it's a fascinating subject and one which fills us with wonder, and also one which perplexes us. And that's a distinctly human thing, is to be curious and seeking knowledge about the world around us. Well, if you take those two things that Aristotle said we desire to know about, ourselves and the world around us, you can divide the curriculum that students receive in our schools into those two categories. In classical education, we study the liberal arts, which are the study of things relating to human beings, and we study the sciences, which is the study of things relating to the world around us. And that means that the education students receive in our schools, in all good liberal arts schools, is an education that is suited to our human nature. It's an education that recognizes who we are fundamentally, despite all of the various differences between us. And it's an education that not only equips us for a happy life, a successful life, but that is attuned to our very nature, our purpose as creatures on this earth. Okay, so that's a little bit about classical education, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about any part of that during the Q&A at the end. Let me talk to you briefly about the way in which classical education is different from progressive education, which is a term to describe what happens in most public schools, many private schools today in this country and across the world. I think ultimately the difference between classical education, which is a return to the old way of doing things, and progressive education, which is an attempt to innovate and discover new things about how we educate young people. The ultimate difference, I think, is a disagreement about the end or goal of education. As I've said, ultimately the goal of a classical education is to help us become fully ourselves, help us become fully happy or thriving or flourishing human beings. And today, if you look at any typical public school, you will see that it has a much narrower goal. Today, in the education world, people talk about education merely in terms of college and career readiness. If you ask the average teacher or the average school leader in this country, how do you know your students will have succeeded? What do you need to see in them to show you that you, the educator, have done a good job? They'll talk to you about the colleges those kids went to. They'll talk about their readiness for careers. They'll talk about the specific jobs that they were trained for. And to be sure, those things are important things, but they're, from the perspective of classical education, they are side benefits or secondary benefits of a true education that speaks to your human nature. If you look at the curriculum of a typical public school, you will see that it's very, very different from what we provide in classical schools. A typical public school curriculum is a skill-based curriculum, and the effort of a lot of schools today is to study students, study their personalities, study their aptitudes, and identify as early as possible what particular job they are going to have when they grow up, what particular career path they're going to follow. And the idea behind a lot of these schools is once you've figured that out through testing and through analysis of the student, then you can provide that child with a specialized education that focuses on that job. So we're turning in this country toward career training rather than a well-rounded foundational education. The result of this, I got to see the result of this when I worked at my school. Students, even very, very young students, were obsessed with figuring out what job they were going to have. I mean, even 12-year-old kids, 10-year-old kids. And this was more than, the childhood dreaming that we all do about, am I going to be an astronaut, or am I going to be a firefighter, or am I going to be the president? These students were much less aspirational in their goals and in their understanding of themselves and their prospects. They thought, my job is to figure out if I'm going to be, working in business, or whether I should be going to graduate school. And they felt an incredible amount of stress about their futures, even at a very, very young age. And of course, worrying about your future when you're very young is kind of counterproductive because you haven't figured out who you're going to be yet. And you haven't even finished becoming who you're going to be. And so it's a narrowing experience for the students. It's a limiting experience for the students. I think all of this is present if you look at the Common Core. The Common Core is a set of national standards which has been introduced in recent years. The Common Core states have a choice about whether to accept the Common Core and adopt it into their respective education systems. Many states have done so, some states have not. If you look at the Common Core standards, they're very functional standards. They're very skill-based standards, and they lack the imagination and the openness that is present in a classical curriculum. One very good book on the Common Core is called The Story Killers, and it's written by Terrence Moore, who is a classical educator and a historian. Terrence Moore describes the difference between the literature standards, the approach to literature that we take in classical schools, and the approach to literature that the Common Core takes. So I'll give you an example of this. Think about a great novel that you've read, maybe one that you read when you were little. One of the books that we read in grammar school, in our classical schools, is called The Wind in the Willows. And it's this beautiful, imaginative story about these woodland creatures. And it's a story about adventure, and it's a story about friendship, and it's all told through the figures of a rat and a mole. And the language is beautiful, and the experience of reading it just opens up your imagination and teaches you a lot about language and about life. Well, the experience of reading that book in a classical school is, it's a beautiful experience, especially if you have a teacher who's really great at reading stories. And a great teacher will help students' imaginations take off and help them understand those deep themes about adventure and about life told through this tale. If you look at the Common Core standards, they want us to take a very clinical, very limiting, very kind of formulaic approach to the reading of stories. And so rather than read the story aloud and talk about it and imagine it and draw pictures of what you're imagining, students would instead be asked a set of formulaic questions. Please list the main characters. Now describe the setting of the story. Now describe the moral of the story. Now describe, the climax of the story and the denouement at the end. And to take that approach to a book as vivid and as exciting as The Wind in the Willows is to suck the life out of it and prevent students from really understanding the truth of what it's about. And so one of the criticisms that I have, that many have about the Common Core, is that it's narrowing our horizons. It's limiting the ability of students to imagine the world and also imagine their own futures because it's so career focused. We can talk more about the Common Core in the Q&A if you would like to. I will also note that there are some real problems with the implementation of the Common Core. It was not tested, it was not piloted with any schools before it was rolled out nationwide. So we don't really know very much about the results of it before it was adopted. And also the way that the Common Core approaches mathematics is really quite problematic. There's a correct way to do mathematics. There's a correct way to teach students, to teach math to kids, and the Common Core is very jumbled and very problematic in its math instruction. So not only does it have this kind of functional approach, but there are parts of it that simply don't work well. Okay, so that's a comparison about classical education and progressive education. In closing, I'd like to talk about Hillsdale College's particular approach to classical education, which I'm calling American classical education. And I'd like to talk to you about how our schools are not only preparing students for happiness and providing an education that's attuned to their human nature, but also preparing them for citizenship in this country. Being a teacher is a challenging thing. It's similar to being a parent, I think, because you spend a lot of time with a group of very young students and you pour yourself into their education, and you work hard with them, and you do all of that without certainty about what's going to happen. And when they graduate, if they've been with the school for a long time, you've known them for 13 years, and they still have huge portions of their lives ahead of them. You don't know where they're going to go to college. You don't know who their college professors are going to be. You don't know quite what job they're going to do. You don't know, you don't know if they're going to get married or not get married. And so huge milestones are still ahead of them. And it can sometimes be a little daunting because you've planted all of these seeds and you're not sure how they're going to flower or whether they're going to flower. One of the things that we remember in Hillsdale schools is that we do know one thing for sure about all of these students, except for a few minor exceptions. We know that they're going to be American citizens. And so we know that about them, and if we do a good job preparing them for that, then we know that will have been good work. The work of preparing students for American citizenship, I think, is essential. If you look at the state of the country today, if you look at the state of civil discourse today, you can see that we're in crisis, and that it would be a very good thing for our country if we raised a group of students who understood citizenship and knew about the responsibility of citizenship and had the academic background to conduct themselves as citizens well. But we're interested in preparing students for American citizenship for other reasons too. If you look at the words of the American founders themselves, you can see that they thought that citizenship, preparation for citizenship, was an essential part of preserving this country, which they created using the Declaration of Independence and then structured using the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, this is a picture of a statue of Thomas Jefferson on the Hillsdale College campus. He wrote, "All men are created equal," and he was one of the intellectual godfathers of the Revolution, as you know. But he also spent an incredible amount of time thinking about education. If you look at the University of Virginia, it was designed, all parts of it were designed, including some of the architecture, by Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote an incredible amount about education in his notes regarding the University of Virginia. And it's clear that Jefferson was thinking through how structurally we could have an education system in this country that would provide for its preservation. Here at Hillsdale College, we regard America as an experiment, and we regard it as something that is not, our freedom is not necessarily something that will continue throughout the next generation. Part of our work to preserve it is to do what Jefferson asked us to do and educate future American citizens so that our country can continue to exist. What is it that we do to educate American citizens? What does it mean to have an education for citizenship? Well, I think it means a couple of things, many of which happen in our schools every day. Students, in order to be citizens of this country, productive and responsible citizens of this country, really need to have an understanding of American history. And if you walk into one of our affiliated schools, you will see that students are learning American history in a real way from the very earliest stages of their education. History in classical schools is taught as a story. We don't tell students what the conclusion they're supposed to draw is first. Instead, we tell them the story of what happened. There's a great new American history textbook that recently came out. It's called Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. And it just tells the story of our country, which is beautiful in some parts, ugly in other parts, but no matter what you're thinking about, you can tell that it's an exciting story. And it's something worth studying because it's so unique, it's so rare. Our students study history in a real way, and they know how to read primary source documents. They know how to They know how to make judgments about history because they've studied it so seriously. In our schools, we also study American government. Students read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They understand why the country was formed, and they're able to explain the structure that was put in place in the Constitution. Over the course of their middle and high school years, they also learn about the changes that have happened in the structure of American government. And they learn about the challenges that our Constitution has been faced with. And they learn how the operation of government today is very different from the operation of government at the time of the American founding. And that means that when they grow up and they're participating as voters and as citizens of this country who are observing the state of national politics, they have a frame of reference for everything that's going on. And that will enable them, we hope, to be good judges of what is right for the country, the things that should be changed and the things that should be preserved. They study America through reading American literature too. One of the beautiful things about classical education is all of the great literature that you get to read. And as I was saying with The Wind in the Willows, sometimes you read it to just delight in it because it's a great story that helps shape your imagination and the language is beautiful. Another purpose for studying American literature, besides the fact that it's just great in and of itself, is that it helps you understand your country better. I remember when I read Little House on the Prairie when I was little, and I love those books, the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. And they're fun books, they're a great story, they're good to read. But also if you're studying the pioneer days in history while reading something like Laura Ingalls Wilder at the same time, it helps you understand the history better because you can imagine what life was like for those people. Another great example is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. We read that in 8th grade in our schools. And that brings color and that brings life, and it allows students to imagine what life was like for slaves in this country. And the challenges that they faced, of course, both before and after they were freed. So the study of American literature kind of gives shape to what students learn in history and government. All of our students in Hillsdale affiliated schools also study rhetoric. They learn how to do public speaking. They learn from a very early age the simple act of courage of getting up in front of people and saying, giving a speech or reciting a poem, which is a very good thing for them to face. The real reasons, or the higher reasons for studying rhetoric, I think are worth mentioning too. Knowing something and being able to explain something to other people are two different things. And the students who go through our schools know a lot. And we want to make sure that they also have the skill to explain what they know to other human beings, because otherwise there would be an incredible loss. It's important, it's important for them to be helpful, in society. And through the ability to explain and analyze the arguments of other people and make persuasive arguments themselves, they're becoming not just keepers of this knowledge, but lights in the world who can help teach others and do good because of the education that they've received. All of our students complete a senior thesis before they graduate. And they get up, they choose a book from the curriculum, something that they've read. I listened to a great one on Frederick Douglass a couple of years ago, and they prepare an academic paper on that thesis. And then they get up in front of their fellow students and their parents, and they give a speech explaining what they have learned from that book. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. It's a great act of courage on the part of these students, but also you learn things from them. And that's a delightful thing if you've been one of their teachers, to have them teach you something before they graduate. Our students also prepare for citizenship by participating in seminar discussion. Seminar discussion happens in the high school years. Students will be reading a great text together. Maybe it's a Shakespeare play. Maybe it's something like Homer's Iliad. And they'll circle up and they'll have their books in front of them, and they'll be led by the teacher through a discussion, a class discussion about the book. Seminar discussion is a valuable thing for students because it teaches them to disagree with each other in a civil way. And this is a skill that has to be learned. When students are in high school, they are afraid to disagree with each other. And if someone does disagree with them, they will often mistake disagreeing with someone's argument for calling that person a bad person, you know, taking an issue with that person morally or in that person's character. And through seminar discussion, they learned that there's a difference between those two things. You can disagree with someone's argument and you can have your argument disagreed with without being, without it being a character issue. And once they've learned that and once they've experienced that, then they become people who can learn through conversation with other people, which is, I think, a really important thing and a really important skill for citizenship. The whole thrust of a student's education shows them that because we're human beings, we have opinions, but it teaches them that their opinions should be based on knowledge. In order to have an opinion, they should be able to back that opinion up. And if they're not able to back that opinion up, then they need to be willing to discard it for an opinion that can be backed up. This is the whole process of becoming wise, which Aristotle says is the highest virtue, the highest intellectual virtue. And Aristotle says the happiest human life, the most productive human life, is the life in which we are seeking wisdom in all things. And that, I think, is the purpose of not just classical education, but an important goal for any citizen in a republic. Well, I want to thank you for your interest today and thank you for your time. And I'm going to stop my screen sharing and answer any questions that you have at this time.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. O'Toole. That was an excellent speech here. We got quite a few questions, and I'll take them in the order they were delivered, okay? There's two questions that are similar. Do your schools specifically focus on teaching students how to critically think? And if yes, how do you do that?
That's a very good question. Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Okay.
You can't do well in one of our schools unless you can think.
Critically think, I think is the key.
Critically think, yeah. It happens in a sort of everyday way in a regular class because there's a lot of conversation between teacher and student. If you walk into a class at one of our schools, students will be standing up, or the teacher will be standing up at the front. The students will be sitting in rows, the way that classrooms used to look. And the teacher will be, you know, providing real content, teaching some real things, but also calling on students to answer questions and ask questions. And that means that students are held accountable every step of the way. And when students get to 9th grade, typically, it depends on the school, but when they get to 9th grade, they receive instruction in formal logic and informal logic. And so they're literally taught how to think critically, how to create an argument that is structurally sound, and how to recognize an argument that isn't structurally sound.
Okay. Another question, these are two related. I made a mistake in the first one. What is the experience and what is the outlook for getting these schools into blue states? And are there states that don't allow your schools?
Yes, yes. So there are 50 states in the Union, 43 of them allow charter schools. The other 7 do not have charter school law, meaning students have to choose between traditional public school and private school. When we would like to start a new school, the first step, when we receive the application from the founding group, the local citizens who want to do it, the first step is to evaluate the location in which they would like to do it and figure out, is it possible? So I'll give you an example. The state of Kentucky has a charter school law. You can start a charter in Kentucky if you want to, except that there's no funding provided by the state of Kentucky. So if you want to do it, it has to be a completely philanthropic effort. In some states, you can start a charter school, but there are so many regulations regarding teacher certification, regarding the curriculum, regarding the the type of operation that the school needs to be, that it's very, very difficult to do a classical school. Because of course, a lot of what is taught in these schools is above and beyond what the states require. You know, no state school, no public school requires the teaching of Latin. All of our schools do. And so the question is, can you actually do it and do it well? And we answer that question on a state-by-state basis.
Okay. Has a formal affiliation with a K through 12 school. Does the school pay Hillsdale for this affiliation or vice versa? What's the financial arrangement, if any?
All of our work is funded by Friends of the College, Friends of the Barney Charter School Initiative. We do not charge the schools anything for our work. When we work with a school, we spend about $250,000 providing teacher training and other equivalent services over the course of the first 3 to 5 years of the school's existence. And all of that is free to the school. We don't ask anything in return except that they do a good job.
Okay. We hear a lot about values today. What is the value system that Hillsdale's teaching is rooted in? Would it be the Bible, for example?
Very good question. I think that the person who wrote this question is making a distinction between values and virtues. Today we talk about values. Really, we should be talking about virtues. And our virtues at the college are rooted in the Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman tradition. So I've been talking a little bit about Greece and Rome today. We look to Aristotle, this great thinker on virtue. And then, of course, we look to the Judeo-Christian tradition, including the Old and the New Testament. And when we provide moral instruction to students, when we talk to them about what does it mean to be a person of good character, we are talking about those ideas from the Bible and from ancient Greece and Rome.
What do you see as the advantages, if any, of this type of education in the time of COVID-19? Does this curriculum seem to provide more structure in the time of virtual learning, or is there no discernible difference from other programs?
That's a great question. So the coronavirus hit in March, and like every K through 12 school, every college in this country, our schools had to adapt quickly. No one was expecting it. And, at the college, the students went home for spring break. They were at home during spring break when the coronavirus happened. So they left campus thinking that they would come back, and then they never got to. So it was a real surprise. We watched and assisted as K through 12 schools across the country figured out what to do for the remainder of the academic year, which was about a quarter long, about 3 months long. And our schools responded more quickly than any, even the public schools, which had all the funding and all the infrastructure. And I think it's because we're more flexible, and also we care a lot about teaching in our schools. When we think about our work, we think about the individual students that are receiving this instruction. And so we saw teachers calling kids on the phone if they didn't have access to a computer, and just doing incredible things to provide for those kids. And I think that we responded more quickly than the average school, so that we could keep things going.
Are languages other than Latin required or offered throughout the school years? In Scandinavian schools, for example, at least 3 foreign languages are required before graduating high school.
Yeah, Scandinavia is very impressive in language instruction. I've been there a couple of times, and I am amazed at the quality of the average, Norwegian person's English. Even people who, don't, it seems like everyone there knows. The answer is yes. Our schools always require Latin, and because Latin starts in 6th grade, students can finish their 3 years of Latin by the time they're in 9th grade, which gives them 3 years of high school to study other languages. What they study depends on the school they go to. At my school, students studied both Spanish and French. afterwards. And I would have loved to add things like German and other languages, but it's just based on the number of students that you have.
Why are charter schools kind of at odds with the teachers union? Why would they not want charter schools, which seems to be the case?
Yes. Well, there are a number of reasons for that. One, I would say, is that charter schools are they were intentionally created pretty recently, actually, in this country, to give parents more of a choice. So the way that the traditional public school mechanism works is you buy a house, and based on the neighborhood that you live in, your child is zoned for a specific public school. And so the teachers and the administrators and the whole school infrastructure doesn't have to do anything to get you, the student, in the doors of the school. That is a real challenge for parents, I think. What it communicates to the average family member is, you know, we've got this. We, the public school educators, are going to handle the education of your child, and it's not necessary for you to really be involved. What charter schools do is say, no, the education of a child is fundamentally important for the education, for the happiness of that child. And the parents of that children should have a role in choosing what is right for that child. And of course, once there's choice, there's competition between the various options. And I can see why the teachers' unions would be a little threatened by that, particularly with high-achieving charter schools like ours.
Okay, this is the last question, okay? Can you discuss the math issues in more detail? I have yet to meet any parents who are satisfied with their math programs at their various schools, either public or private. What is the way forward with that?
Yeah, it took me until I worked in these schools to understand about math, because I did not have a great math education. It was okay. I went to good schools, but I struggled with it, and I was frustrated by it. There is an international test called the TIMSS, TIMMS, and what it does is it measures the math abilities, math education of students in elementary grades across the entire country, or sorry, the entire world. And if you look at the results of the TIMSS, you will see that students in Asian countries typically perform very, very well on the TIMSS. And there were a few years when the country of Singapore was right at the very, very top. Now, why was that? Well, they had this curriculum, which we use in our schools. It's called Singapore Math. And it does a couple of things that American math instruction does not do well. It teaches concepts in the right order, and it ensures that students who are doing math problems do not get to do those problems correctly unless they have a deep understanding of what's actually happening in the mathematics. So let me give you an example. When I was younger, lots of people are like this, I did really, really well in mathematics. And it was because I was really good at figuring out patterns. I was really good at copying what the teacher had done and doing it on my own paper. But I didn't really understand what I was doing or why I was doing it. I was just copying. And that was possible because of the type of problems I had been given. In Singapore Math, all of the problems that you do when you're little are word problems, which means you have to set up the algorithm, set up the addition problem or the division problem or whatever it is yourself. And you can't do that correctly unless you understand what the question is asking. And so Singapore Math does a really good job of making sure that students develop a concrete understanding of mathematics, which they then use to solve the math problem. And that means that they develop math confidence, they develop the ability to do math and think mathematically, and they're not, I mean, these kids, it's amazing, they don't have the anxiety that typical math students have around math because they've been taught it in a way that gives them confidence.
Interestingly enough, before we close, many people watching today are at or involved with the Chautauqua Institution. And we started back in the late 1800s something called the CLSC, which was the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, which attempted, through the reading of various books on poetry, science, history, to create kind of a classical education, even though it wasn't formally in a classroom. And it was a way also for women, particularly who were uneducated or undereducated would be a better word, because that was their station in life, to really come to the forefront with that thing. Anyway, that's just I want
Yeah.
to, you can comment?
No, I think that's a great point. I
Yeah.
think that's a great point.
Okay.